Three of you touched on this in your remarks a little bit. This is a literary arts organization, though, so I did want to start there. Alex, you mentioned over 2001 being, history, I suppose you referred to it as. I think since then we've been fortunate to see that there's been a lot of media to portray not just LGBTQ individuals, but also individuals of color. There's been more representation across movies, TV shows, across the culture that we all share. But why books? Why are books you don't see people protesting outside movie theaters or outside Netflix headquarters for why are books sort of the front of this, and why are they so important? Alex, I'll start with you for that one.
Well, from the point of view as a reader and as an author, for me it's because, any other media, we're sort of experiencing it out there. But when we read those little squiggles, black squiggles on white paper, something happens in our imaginations. And that's what creates that deep, profound emotional experience where we can, fall in love with a character, where we can be reading so intently that someone comes up behind us and we're like, because we're lost in that world. And so that's where I think the power of books come from. That it's such an internal experience. Reading for us is such an internal experience. And in that sense, it can be so empowering, because it's like we're becoming those characters. What they're going through, the emotions and challenges and joys, all the emotions that they're going through, we're going through as we read. And I think that's why books really are dangerous, because they can, incite us to action, whether it's positive action or negative action, because it is that such a internal emotional journey.
Cody, Susan, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the movie and streaming are interesting examples because those are largely private acts, right? They're often done in the home or against a movie theater, but they're also done through private exchange. Like you have to pay for a streaming service, you have to pay to go see a movie, right? Whereas when we think of schools and libraries, those are, much to the current administration's anger, free to everyone, right? They are public spaces that say, there, in theory, is no entry to being here. If you exist here, you can come in and be here. And why we see fights over libraries and public schools, and we've seen these fights since at least the 50s, is largely because these are fights over who gets to belong in public spaces, right? Who gets to be seen and who gets to say whose stories matter. If we think about K-12 schooling as preparation for life in a democratic society, not preparation for a job, but that's a different story, preparation for life in a democratic society, we can think of the curriculum we read as a map to say, this is what it means to be ready to be prepared to engage within our democracy. So what does it mean, for instance, if a kid goes through K-12 schooling and never reads an LGBTQ gay author, never reads a Native author, right? It sends the message that you don't need to understand these experiences or histories to be able to act in a pluralistic democracy. And so I think the biggest reason we see these fights on books is because they're in public spaces. And when we say people who historically have been left out deserve to be in schools, deserve to be in libraries, we're saying we have to live up to the ideals of a pluralistic democracy where everyone matters. And as we're seeing with books around policy, but also books around things like trans healthcare, policies around voting rights, we're seeing the folks who want to ban books also want to shrink the idea of a pluralistic democracy because they think the democracy only belongs to a few people, right? But it doesn't. It belongs to all of us.
That's right. I think that there's something, magical about a book. Again, the American Academy of Pediatrics, we give free books to children from birth to age 12, with the Reach Out and Read program. There's something magical that happens. It's a window into a world. It's a point of discussion starting from infancy. And then, the right to read or the right to literacy is something that also is challenged because, literacy rates are lower in lower income schools. So you're already limiting who can have access to those ideas by who you're, helping to learn to read, and the quality of language arts that's being taught. And so, there's a huge movement now about, reading as a right? And so bringing that to all schools. So, it's very interesting, and you know, having that right for everybody, because then it might be scary for some, because then everyone's got all the tools at their disposal. Yeah.
That's lovely context for what I'd like to move into next, which is sort of more of a tactics discussion. I think I shared with the panelists by email that the crowd we would have today is largely one that is already understanding or against book bans, against censorship. So what we'd like to talk a little bit about today is some tactics. We saw in Penfield recently that there were several very charged, would be the nicest way to describe it, school board meetings on certain issues, banning specific books. There was one gentleman who showed up in a gorilla costume, so that was a clear like racist attack against it. And they did run some school board, some folks for school board in the election. Fortunately, they lost, but in my view, it was a little too close for comfort there with the results. They did lose, but Sue, we'll start with you for this one. If agitators show up at your local school board and they're trying to remove a book, what can you, as a parent who's against this, or just a community member who's against this, how can you support your school board if they're in the place where they want to do the right thing, but we're not quite sure of the issues, nobody's an expert, as you said.
Right.
What can folks do in the community?
Well, there's a lot of things that, you know, you can do, hopefully leading up to that type of like extreme, you know, head that came to. You know, one of the things, so there's Dr. Christina Lee is also in the audience, who's a fellow board member with me, so I'll look to her a lot to like, you know, nod or shake her head. You know, but one of the things that you can do as community members is to try not to silence anyone before they're able to hopefully share whatever they want to share in a peaceful and respectful manner. And so like at the beginning of a board meeting, it's a requirement to have public participation. And so everyone is allowed to come and share 3 minutes of what's on their mind. And if people are prepared for that and they know that they can share, as long as it offers no hate speech and it is not infringing upon the rights of others or intimidating anyone, they're able to share it. And so, you know, trying not to meet people at the door. I think allowing people to come in and say, I'll give you your 3 minutes, but then I will also take my 3 minutes. And then what we can do as community members is share your positive experiences. And if it's too, you know, harmful to ask someone who feels marginalized to share their experience, you know, allies or others who do see themselves recognized in a book or can see why that book would be helpful for their own child, who might not directly identify, but who would appreciate having a window into the lives of others. Like sharing that positive is extremely important, because as you and I were chatting at the head of time, it's so much easier and so much more often for people to share criticism and things that are wrong. And a lot of times, the things that are good are not mentioned. We just go along assuming it's going to be that way. But it is important to recognize and speak out for things that are going well and things that you think are important. And so sharing your positive experience with the board or why it's working is really an important tactic.
Cody, Alex, additional thoughts?
I think I'm really glad you said that, because we have a lot of data that shows school board elections have really low turnout, right? And there's all sorts of reasons for that. They're normally not the same. They're not in November, right? That's
Right.
presidential elections. And in general, even November midterm elections have lower turnout than presidential elections. So one, it doesn't take a lot to flip a school board seat. So like, you know, you and some friends can take out a Moms for Liberty candidate through the democratic process. It's not super difficult because of turnout. And the other is, one of the most radical acts you can do is go with a friend to your school board and just say, this teacher did this librarian did this principal did this, and I'm happy they did it, right? No, you don't have to go like, for a few reasons. One, school board members need to hear like positive feedback, right? That the people who are gonna vote on them like their actions, they like what the school's doing. And then I also think it's a smart tactic, right? Because we live in a mediated world where everything is on social media. Raise your hand if you've seen a clip of someone acting wild, buck wild at a school board meeting. Yeah, we've seen them, right? So like, you know, when the person gets up there and goes off about all sorts of weird stuff about when they're like, why is a first grader reading genderqueer? And you're like, well, they're not. But they're going off about it, right? Like, and that creates its own kind of image that people get in their mind. For you to then come up and just be like, no, I'm thankful this school board did that in a calm, collected manner, also is much easier to build a coalition, right? If you're scrolling on social media, like whose side do you want to be on? The person who's screaming about a first grader reading genderqueer, or the person who's just like, thanks for doing something to like help kids have more access to books, right? So there's like a imagery battle there too.
Everything they say. I think the only thing, I write the books, and that's my activity. Support everything they say.
Awesome. Cody, I want to talk, and I gleaned this from you on WXSI talking about this a couple of weeks ago. The topic of soft censorship is one that interests me. I was hoping you could speak a little to that and how like pernicious that can be in regards to our schools and our specific teachers as well.
Yeah, so I think in these conversations, some definitions are important, right? So, like, because of the composition of the New York State legislature and who is in the governor's race, New York will never pass, like, the version of the Don't Say Gay Act that Florida passed, right? Just, like, it won't happen. However, that doesn't mean that censorship efforts don't happen in the state, or that anxiety around professionalism and your ability to keep your job cause you to not censor or not. And so, for instance, we know that teachers can come in with like, I'm gonna teach this book and I'm gonna do this because it's the right thing, but then before they have tenure, they might say, oh, I don't wanna shake the table, right? I don't wanna do anything that could get me in trouble. Or even after they have tenure, they might say, I don't wanna deal with like someone from the community harassing me, for instance, for reading any LGBTQ book or any kind of book that ends up on these kind of Moms for Liberty website. And so that's what we call like soft censorship, right? The state isn't doing it, a district's not doing it, but the pressure from community or even perceived pressure, like the perceived pressure, causes teachers to limit what kids read. Again, out of a worry of their own ability to exist as a professional. And one of the best ways we can combat that kind of self-censorship is, again, just through positive reinforcement, right? If a teacher updates their curriculum and includes a book that you know, like maybe you personally are happy it's there, but you know it's maybe controversial, go to your school board and say, I'm happy this book is there, right? Email your school principal and say, I'm happy this book is there. And I will also say for folks who don't have kids, but like even if you don't have kids, your taxpayer dollar goes towards paying for schools, right? You're a member of the community. And so even being a community member and saying, thank you for including these books, thank you for including them in the library, can go a long way too to kind of create that environment of knowing this is a good thing that we're doing. Because, you know, teachers are under attack. Teachers famously don't get paid that much money, right? It's a very hard job. And so I never fought any teacher who says, I'm gonna quote unquote play it safe because I'm worried about my livelihood, right? It's our job as community members to show up and create a culture where those teachers don't feel like their livelihood is threatened. And that doesn't take a lot of work. It's like an email, right? Or showing up to a school board with a friend. School board and drink party. Like, you know what I mean? Like, grab a little drink and then go to a school board meeting. Or go to a school board meeting and then have a drink. I get you. You know your limits. Do what brings you peace. You're an adult.
Yeah, what I would add to that is that you know, we used to hear, oh, your book got banned, that's great, it's gonna increase sales. That's not how it works. And that's especially not how it works for books for young people. When a book is banned, and because of groups like Moms for Liberty, it's like it's much more coordinated now, where they have these lists, and where school teachers or librarians, they can see which books, you know, are going to be controversial, and if they don't get that support, then they'll be skittish. You know, the reality is in most schools, you know, resources are limited. So for a teacher or a librarian to order a book that you know, they think, well, you know, there's this other book, and I know with this other book, you know, it's I'm not going to be challenged for it. So that's, you know, as you're mentioning, that's the level of, you know, soft censorship. And, you know, I have gotten invited to, you know, schools and you know, NCT conventions and places where I talk with teachers, and they'll be like, yeah, I wish I could order your books, but even at the district level, it's going to have to go through approval at the district level in some districts, and they just, you know, they won't allow it. And so it's like for young people, then oftentimes the first way they get introduced to books, start reading is through teachers and school librarians, also public librarians. And so it's like they won't have heard of books if they never get into those public spaces.
Yeah, go.
No, I just want to quickly add too, in the United States, there's no real federal policy for picking books. That's not how it works. It's very localized for a whole bunch of reasons. And one thing that you can do is look into your the policy making at your district about how books are selected, and if a book is challenged, what's the process? Because often there is a community board that does that, like the school board will pull community members to adjudicate a text, to adjudicate a book. If you have time, volunteer for that, right? Be the person who is like, I'm not worried if genderqueer is going to like a 12th grade English class, right? Like, because there's a lot of power on that, and it's one of these kind of like hidden, slow, boring mechanisms, but there's a lot of power there. So if your district has a committee for book selection, join it, because the Monster Liberty people are joining it, right? We have to like catch up.
I was gonna say just about just the process, so to talk about how the process of choosing a book. So in New York State, the state education department says, here are the educational standards in all of these subjects we want to achieve. And then it's up to the individual district to put the curriculum together, which teaches to those educational standards. And so, within a district, oftentimes it's the superintendent, it's the principal, it's the library media specialist, or your librarian, and then a few other teachers. Sometimes with parents, sometimes without. But what you would hate to have happen is that committee have heard from an angry parent about a book they don't want, and then that is the only thing in their mind when they say don't order that book. If you had that positive, boy, it would be really great to be hearing about this topic, or if the student themselves were like, I'd like to hear about this, that would almost just, really empower them to go ahead and choose that text then, because that's how it's being done. And people can come to the school board and rant and rave all they want, and dress up however they want, but the board is not going to change policy based on that. It's not how it works. It goes back to our curriculum and our committee and the library media specialist. And so if you have positive things to say, the principal or your librarian is a great place to share that positive feedback, because that really does help how you choose the body of work.
And there are literal lists Moms for Liberty have. They literally have lists that are like, these are the books, right? I mean, you've probably seen where there's this thing of people who are banning books haven't even read the books, right? And it's right, because they have a strategy, right? If you don't even, here's the book, here's what you say to get it banned, right? But as you're getting at, there are also mechanisms where we can intervene in that.
And Alex has been on a few of those lists himself. Oh boy, yeah. I know that PEN America is one organization that I'm familiar with that has a lot of really good resources on its website addressing what you guys were talking about, how you can support school board members and teachers. Are there others out there that you would point people to? Anybody?
Unite Against Book Bans is a really great organization. So it's just Unite Against Book Bans. They have a literal PDF of how to show up to your school board, and it's literally choose your adventure. Do you want to talk about books? Do you want to talk about this, and then it's a script, right? You only get 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Pretty short, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You just have to go, all of these are recorded, so if you get 2 friends, you all go up and say something, that's 9 minutes of a school board meeting that are dedicated to getting good books in kids' hands. So never reinvent the wheel, just follow the guide.
Any other thoughts on that, or just resources, or just want to make sure we have people leaving here with something that they can, we're all activated at this point.
Yeah.
I think people want something to do, and so if there are ways people can get involved.
One more.
Go ahead if you want to. Indivisible, really great organization. They have a really good guide right now that's not necessarily related to books, but it's a really good guide of policies school districts need to adopt to support undocumented students and undocumented families. And I really, really encourage you, if you just Google Indivisible Schools Undocumented Students, it's a really good guide of here are all the steps that school districts could take and policies to implement to protect undocumented students. Because whether you know this or not, there is a Supreme Court case, Loud v. Nichols, that says undocumented students have a right to public education, right? Citizenship is not a reason for, is not a gatekeeper for public education. The governor of Texas just said the Supreme Court should overturn that decision, but that's a whole other story. Tomorrow's panel. God, if the Supreme Court ever sees that, right? They're busy
stripping away other rights. But really highly also say, look at that guide as well and ensure that your school district has those policies to protect undocumented students and families, especially in this moment.
And I would just reiterate, like, if you do show up to your school board member or you do talk to your librarian, you don't have to be very eloquent. You don't have to like make a case for your existence or the reason it needs to be there. It can just be like, this is meaningful to me and this is meaningful for my child. And that is so powerful. I mean, we've seen it happen at our district, you know, where our superintendent, it was genderqueer, was called under question during a public session. And we had received an email from a student. And so our superintendent was able to say, we have, just like you shared a personal story and said, for this reason, this is an issue of humanity, and of course this book stays, right? Because these are issues of humanity, which are not controversial, right? Yeah.
And to add to that too, New York State does have policies that the gender, I can't remember, just gender, just trust me on it. I promise I know what I'm talking about. But New York State does have protections specifically for LGBTQ students. And New York State DOE put out guidelines back in 2023 supporting trans and non-binary students. And in those guidelines, there's vague language about curriculum because, again, the state can't say which books to read and which not to read. Yeah. But in those guidelines, there is some vague language around curriculum that you can also take and say, we need to live up to the letter of the law in New York policy, which says our queer, trans, non-binary kids have rights to those kind of books.
And just one more thing. What's interesting also is that something that we don't talk about a lot of is that, like, rather than like the one mom for Liberty who doesn't want her kid to read the book, there's an exception that can be made for that student to sit out and not have to read it or not check it out of the library. Parents have rights, so they run on these campaigns of parent rights. There are parent rights. Your child is not going to be forced to read genderqueer as a second grader. They're not going to be forced to read it. You can opt out, but you don't want to ruin the experience for everybody else. And those who are trying to actually not have their child read the book probably are the ones who should read the book. But there still are those, they can opt out. And so I think that's important too. When someone's like super heated about a book, you can just talk to your library media specialist and the principal, and your kid can sit in the hallway.
Yeah, and I'm like a left-wing radical queer teacher in Florida, right? I taught high school 9th grade English for almost a decade, and I taught Sherman Alexie's Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Has anyone read that book? Frequently on a Sherman Alexie, whole other story for a different time, but it was a different, before we knew. And that's a book that's frequently on banned books. It's like page 19, I'll never forget it. It's a masturbation joke. I know it because I knew when the kids got to it, whenever we read it as a class, it's like, it says ambidextrous, and I was like, you have to use context clues to figure out what that means. So, a little masturbation joke, vocab learning there. That was a book that I always, when I would send it out, would say, parents, community, heads up, this book is frequently challenged, or people have issues with it. I encourage you to check out reviews here, and here, but if you don't want your kid to read it, we can find an alternative. And there was always like one or two kids who we found an alternative. So I say that to say this kind of fear tactic that we often see with Moms for Liberty of your radical, angry communist teacher is making all your kids trans or whatever, of which I've been accused of being that radical queer teacher. Even I was like, you can pick a different book if you don't want your kid to read it, right? So that is the fact of just public schools in general. Whatever book, if a parent doesn't want their kids to read it, teachers will find an alternative. It's often teachers and school boards who are reasonable with these alternatives. It's the folks who want to ban books who are not reasonable.
Yeah.
We're going to open it up to audience questions in just a second. I just wanted to offer one more comment, which is we've talked about school boards, and we did mention individual teachers as well, but if you have a kid in a school district and they're reading something you appreciate, tell the teacher. Please tell the teacher. There's a psychological phenomenon whereby a negative review of something, it takes 12 positive comments to overcome that negative review. So one angry parent who says, I don't want your kid reading this, you can imagine as a teacher psychologically that would wear on you. That's draining, and it can take a dozen comments in the other direction for them to still to go back to feeling good about it, right? So do tell your individual teachers. So do folks in the audience have anything they'd like to hear from the panelists? We'll just do hands if Rachel?
So I read a study a while ago that said that folks who read fiction have higher levels of empathy than any other genre that you can read. And I found this to be completely fascinating. And, you know, as a bookseller in 2020, I noticed a ton of nonfiction selling, people wanting to understand, and learn and self-educate and all that. But while there's the knowledge, the empathy, and we're not gonna fall in love with Kyle and, you know, have this very intense experience that you have when two characters are interacting with one another. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about why empathy is so important in this culture and why books like Alex's maybe also, you know, educating oneself is incredibly important, but we need a little column A, a little column B.
Sure, I can start. I mean, I love that you brought that up because it touches on several different issues, and part of it, you know, goes back to what I talked about before, that when we're reading fiction, we're stepping into characters' shoes, and so we're experiencing the world through their eyes. You know, we're in their skins, and so, you know, if it's someone who's not like us, you know, it's sort of like, well, we're seeing the world, you know, in a new way, and that can, you know, break stereotypes and invite us into other cultures and other experiences, or, you know, maybe, you know, the character is, you know, in an abusive household, and all of a sudden we understand we feel what that's like. We don't get the statistics on it, you know, about kids being abused. It's like we understand, you know, what that's like. So, in that sense, you know, in terms of that, at the same time, though, you know, nonfiction books, there's a wide variety. But so many nonfiction books now are narrative nonfiction, because so much nonfiction has come to understand, you know, how much a more emotional impact there can be, you know, when it's telling a story. And a story is like, it's all about empathy. It's like, you know, it started here, and then because of these experiences, it ends there. So that's something else that I see, you know. Then the last point is that, this is what I'm really passionate about, is that most fiction, whether it's for young people or you know, adults, it's like girls and women are reading fiction. You know, the vast majority, 70% and up of those books, are being read by females, young people who, you know, identify as females, and the sales figures, you know, testify to that. And that comes into a bigger issue in terms of how, you know, boys are treated and raised in our culture, where boys from a very early age are shut down emotionally. And then when it comes time to reading, boys don't read, in part because, you know, my dad, this is my dad, right? Older guy, right? Older guy, you know, there used to be this magazine called Reader's Digest. And they had these lovely little personal vignette stories in there, you know, the most unforgettable character I ever met, or This American Life, something like Life in America. And I would ask my dad, did you read that story? Did you read that story? He's like, I don't like those stories. I say, why? He's like, because they make me feel. And I think that's so true for so many boys in this culture. So when it comes time to read, it's like they don't like to read fiction unless it's about sports. You know, sports are safe, you know, you can have feelings about sports. But if it's about relationships, whether it's relationships with girls or with boys or non-binary, whatever, it's all of a sudden, it's like, we're oftentimes just not raised to know what to do with feelings. And so, and then, you know, as adults, then, you know, we got adults who are making decisions without empathy. Because it's like, you know, as guys, we haven't been acculturated that way. So it's a complex problem. And then so many books that get written, then it's like, well, the audience is going to be girls, may as well write about girls. And so, and then it's like the books that are on reading lists, so oftentimes they're girl characters, and the boys are like, I don't know. Makes them even more uncomfortable, because they're being asked to identify with girls. And again, that sort of, you know, that sort of empathy isn't supported in our culture. So it's a really complex issue, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Which is maybe good that it's we have English classes where children read fiction, man. That's mandatory.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. That's all for me. Yeah, thank you.
Any other thoughts on fiction and empathy before we go to the next?
Just people are moved by stories, not statistics, right? It's why you can say this terrible tax bill is going to cut Medicaid for X amount of families. That's bad. But then when you show the family that's going to be cut, people are like, not that, right? Same thing that like if you ask Americans on like undocumented people's rights, like, depending on how you ask, you can get 50-50, but then you show a story of an undocumented family and people are like, oh no, they should be citizenship. They should be allowed, right? So people are just moved by stories more than statistics. There's probably a better anthropological reason for that, but not my ministry, not my training.
And I was gonna say, it's funny, my intro was like, I made it through med school, and the first thing I did was like to rush to the fiction to get my empathy back. So, isn't that interesting? So, a lot of like my education of medical students is like how to like get your empathy back, because it's like beaten out of you. That'll be the panel after next.
Yes, yeah.
But how to like regain that empathy, and fiction helps.
Yeah.
It does. So,
Go to that, Rick.
Yeah, if I could just dovetail on this issue of the dichotomy between fiction and non-fiction. A lot of non-fiction has got fiction in it. And I want to point out a book that was a window for me. I'm a physician too. And this is a book that I wish I'd read many, many years ago. Mind you, it's only just come out, so I couldn't have done. But it's a book by David J. I don't know if you know of his work he came up with a book on relationality. And it's about his own journey of being an asexual person, which I was never educated in medical school about. And it's a fascinating story because he uses this lens of his own personal story about the point that you were just making, which is about relationships. And it's such an eloquent book that explores the complexities of being an asexual adolescent growing up and how alienating that was, and having to pretend that he was in love when he wasn't, because it didn't, that was the expectation. But I don't know if you're familiar with his work or not, but it's only recently come out, and it took about a window that just blew me out of the water in terms of thinking about how people need to learn how, because the people who are most marginalized often have the most to say about relationship failures. So anyway, that's a book that you might want to have it here. I don't know if you want it. Okay.
What's the author's name again, Rick?
David J. It's called Relationality. And the nice thing about it, it's spoken. I love it when authors read their own books because it just adds that third dimension of conveying something that you can't see reading between the lines. So anyway, I highly recommend reading that book.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Like, raise your hand if you learned when you were growing up, you learned fiction is fake, non-fiction is real. That's like our version of that definition. That's like how it's typically taught. There's an English teacher, I can't remember her name, so I'm going to be bad at citations here, but she was like, I want my kids to rethink this, and I want them to think of non-fiction as things that have happened. Non-fiction is learning from things that have happened. Yeah. Fiction is learning from the imagination. And I like that framing of like, you learn from both, you just learn different things, rather than this like real, not real, because if we say real, not real, we typically privilege the real over the not real.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone in the back there.
Yes, hi, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming and having this. My question is, we've heard how you approach the school board. We heard how you try to kind of change the culture around certain books and being more inclusive. How do you do that with family and the people around you? How do you engage where you let people know? Because I wish I would have known your book when I was younger, because I think it would have, one, helped me as an adult, but two, I didn't have access to that. And my brother is going through his journey with his sexuality. And so just being able to try to bring that to, the people that you can engage with and change the culture at a more grassroots level than just at the school board. So that's my question.
Do you have?
Yeah.
Go for it.
I think this is really important, all the tactics and so forth. because I'm real tired of thoughts and prayers. No more thoughts and prayers, okay? To me, true allyship is when you do things that make you uncomfortable. Okay, go ahead and read a book. That's safe, okay? But there are things you can do in your immediate family circles with the people you contact with every day, right? And it is not easy. Your heart will be faster, your hands might shake, okay? And you have 0.75 seconds. When someone says something, okay, you have so little time to come back to them. Because you can't like, oh, I'll think about that and then we'll talk about this later. It doesn't happen, right? So you rehearse with a friend. You say things like, this is the easiest one. Sorry, could you say that again? Okay? They know what you mean. I am going to make you say that asshole thing again. Okay? And 90% of the time they're like, I'll forget it. Okay? Another one. Could you tell me why you think that? Could you tell me why you think that? I'm gonna listen. Could you tell me why you think that? But you have to practice these, and you have to be ready, right? And there's all sorts of other things, like when I love a book, I haven't done this with Rainbow Boys, I probably should, I buy 5 copies. You come to my house, I just give you one. Okay, I know that takes a certain financial ability, but you can buy them secondhand, you can buy them, inexpensively. And one I remember doing this with was All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiley, which showed a race riot from a white and a black point of view, 2 teens. Just things like that. So you can do things, that's the most local, right? Your own circle is the most local. And it is so hard at first. It is so hard to tell. And the thing about it is, you're not gonna change Uncle whatever his name is at Thanksgiving dinner. But you're gonna let him know that it is not okay to say that in front of me. Okay? That is the important thing. The important thing is, you can think that and I'm not gonna change you, but you don't say that in front of me and people I love. Right? So that's maybe one of the hardest things. But if you practice, it gets easier. If you practice, it becomes more and more second nature until you stand up in front of that school board and you can do it because you practiced with your own circle. It's hard, but it does get easier. And that's true allyship, is when it's uncomfortable to be an ally.
Input from another band author. We're at the top of the hour, so any final thoughts from our panelists before we, go ahead.
Just because I think too, in addition to that, leading with whatever you know. So I really appreciate earlier you said school boards often aren't educators, right? It's people from the community. And you don't have to be an educator or whatever to do this work, but lead with your own experiences. So for instance, when I would have parents who maybe were upset about Sherman Alexie, right? I would always say, if you have questions before you skip to my kid can't read it, let's just chat, right? And rather than say, there's a version of me that goes into activist mode that wants to list all the angry, just terrible, blah, blah, and they're like, bro, I don't care, I want my kid to read it, right? That's not helpful. But what is helpful is saying, I think of my own self, and I never read a native author growing up. And it wasn't until college that I did, and I just don't want that to be the case for your kid, right? So leading with that expertise, or when I think of people wanting to make panic around trans kids being able to use the bathroom at school, and they get caught up in all these stories that they see, and I just think about the 14-year-old who I taught, who I loved, and that kid just wanted to do well in school, and they just had to pee, and they wanted to pee in peace, and shouldn't everyone be able to pee in peace? Do you know what I mean? Leading with that. So whether you're a teacher, whatever you do, you have expertise that can lead into these conversations, and we know from social psychology and whatnot that people trust people they're closest to, right? So and when you can lead into your expertise and rely on that relationship, that can help thaw some of that hardship, right? Because it's very easy to say, I don't want my first grader to read genderqueer. And I'm well, yeah, I don't want any first grader to read genderqueer, just like I don't want first graders to read Romeo and Juliet, right? No one is saying that, right? But let's have a conversation, and anytime we can lean into our experiences, and remind people that people who are demonized are just humans, and often we're talking about kids who just want to live their lives, right? And reminding that, I think, is one way to Linda Sue's point. You're not going to win the most kind of angry, fascist MAGA person, but fortunately, that's not most of the voting population. You said there was another question.
Did you have a question? bring in a friend here, because I thought you did right when you said, but.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, if we don't have time, it's fine, but,
No, we can do.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
I
just-
think
Yeah.
I can do one more. Yeah.
sure, specifically to you, Sue, you mentioned that, there was a incident with, genderqueer, and you mentioned that the superintendent, read the email. I was just curious, based on your, experience on the school board, have you seen more people complaining about these type of books? Less like, has that come out as well?
No, it was pretty isolated.
Okay.
We had a few sort of Moms for Liberty, who sort of surfaced around like election time. COVID mask mandates, was an issue. We actually watched a live demonstration of like what they thought a mask was like, with a sieve and sand going through it, a very dramatic sort of demonstration of what I'm not quite sure, but
They love the drama.
they love the
They
drama,
love the drama.
but it's very, very much isolated. But again, a lot of that is because I think we're so open and we do welcome everyone to come and share. And I think that scares a lot of people out, because they just are like, I don't wanna go if it's not gonna be televised, So, good question, but it's an more isolated event.
Every district is different though.
It's
so
true.
Every district has different stressors, and I think, one of the things that would be important is that community members think about running for school board.
Yes.
Yeah, wait, applause to that.
Bring your own individual expertise. You don't have to be on anything to run for the school board. And in fact, our best school members are those, a diverse body that represents everybody in the community. And oftentimes they're the best listeners,
One more in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jerry Smansky. I'm the librarian at the Lilac Library.
Wait, shout out.
And I'm sorry I'm a little late. I had 2 other meetings scheduled, but I knew about this because I read the article in the Beacon. So thanks for getting that out there. And I saw the poster of Javas, so. But I want to let you know that we actually have a very large collection of YA books. We have an entire bookshelf this tall full of YA novels, and we have some YA nonfiction books. We have books for kids, and then we have literally thousands of other books for adults, novels and nonfiction books, fiction anthologies. We're now the largest circulating LGBTQ library in New York State. We have over 11,000 items in our catalog. We have DVDs, we have audio recordings, and we're sort of outside of the entire system of what could be book bannable, I guess you could say, because we're our own independent organization. We're a member of the Rochester Regional Union, which is the successor of the Out Alliance. Our library space is open on Wednesday nights from 6 till 8, Friday nights from 6 till 8, and we're open longer on Sunday from 12 to 4. Today we had as many as 16 people in the space, just a couple blocks away, checking things out, bringing things back, volunteering, putting furniture together. It's been really pretty wonderful. So I've been involved for the last 20 years or so. And I have been watching a lot of what's been happening, of course, in Penfield most recently. And then in 2023, of course, we had a bomb threat called to Hilton Central Schools. And it was over the book called This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson, which we of course have in our collection. So I've been, keeping tabs on all this. But I wanted to make sure that you all knew that there was an alternative that is separate from all of this, and we're happy to help. So thank you. Oh gosh, thanks for the applause.
And one more round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you. Stick around if you'd like to grab a copy of Rainbow Boys or
Like 5 copies.